Some PlayStation games never got the spotlight they deserved. Maybe they were overshadowed by bigger releases, were too quirky, or maybe didn't fit the time. But years later, those same flaws feel more like charm, and what was once ignored can now be appreciated for what they really are or tried to be. From unsettling cult horror to strange little experiments you couldn't imagine being greenlit today, these are 11 older PlayStation games, mostly horror or horror adjacent, that deserve a second chance. If you could, please subscribe and ring the bell. Also leave a like if you like the content. Back in 2006, Rule of Rose came out with a premise that was always going to stir the pot. A surreal, psychological horror set in 1930s England, told through the lens of a young woman trapped in a cruel, nightmarish orphanage. On paper, that sounds like a bold, artsy move for the PS2 era. In practice, it ended up becoming one of the most controversial games of its generation, and not in the way that gets you Game of the Year awards. Critics at the time hammered it for clunky combat, sluggish pacing, and controls that felt like they were working against you. Some of the outrage came from misinformation, sensationalist headlines claiming the game depicted things it absolutely didn't, but the damage was done. Stores pulled it, copies became rare, and the game's actual content was buried under urban legend. Here's the thing, though. Beneath those janky mechanics is a deeply unsettling, emotionally layered experience. Its oppressive atmosphere, haunting score, and strange dream logic stick with you in a way most horror games don't. It's less about jump scares and more about slowly crawling under your skin. The symbolism is heavy. The imagery is disturbing without relying on gore, and it leaves you with more questions than answers, in a good way. Is it perfect? Not even close. But it's one of those games where the flaws are almost part of the charm. If you can push past the awkward combat and occasional frustration, you'll find a story that's as bold as it is uncomfortable, the kind of experience that lingers in the back of your mind years later. And maybe, just maybe, it deserves to be remembered for more than the headlines.
Holy water ran from it until recently.
Koudelka is one of those oddball titles that makes you wonder how it even got greenlit in the first place. Released on the PS1 in '99, it tried to mash up survival horror atmosphere with turn-based JRPG combat. And at the time, that was just confusing for most people. Fans of horror were thrown off by slow, grid-based battles, and RPG players didn't quite know what to do with the eerie silence, limited ammo, and exploration-heavy pacing. It didn't fit neatly into any genre box, and reviews punished it for that. The story centers on a sarcastic, sharp-witted medium, investigating a creepy Welsh monastery in 1898. The setting alone is a mood, flickering candles, crumbling stone halls, and monsters that feel ripped out of religious nightmares. The voice acting was unusually strong for its time. The dialogue had bite, and the tone was darker and more mature than most RPGs dared to be back then. But yeah, it has issues. The combat is slow, inventory management is clunky, and random encounters can kill the pacing. It's one of those games where you feel the developer's ambition pushing against the PS1's limits, sometimes breaking the flow completely. And yet, that ambition is exactly why it's so interesting today. What makes this worth revisiting now is how unapologetically strange it is. It's not trying to please everyone. It's telling a grim, personal story in a setting you rarely see in games, with moments that feel genuinely unsettling. For players who can forgive the mechanical rough edges, it offers a haunting mix of gothic atmosphere and character-driven narrative that you won't get from anything else on the PS1. It might not have been a hit, but it's unforgettable once you've spent a night in that monastery.
What have I been doing with my...
Released in 2002 for the PS2, The Mark of Cree is the kind of game that made you stop in a store and do a double take. On the surface, it looked like a Saturday morning cartoon, bright colors, exaggerated characters, and a clean, almost Disney-like art style. But the second you got into combat, you realized this was no kid's game. Heads rolled, bodies crumpled, and finishing moves were shockingly brutal for something that looked this wholesome. That contrast alone confused the hell out of both reviewers and players, which probably explains why it never found a huge audience. At its core, this was an action-adventure with a clever combat system. Instead of button mashing, you locked onto multiple enemies at once using the right stick, assigning different attack buttons to each target. It felt fluid and strategic, way ahead of its time in some ways. But it wasn't exactly easy to explain in a trailer, and if you didn't get it, fights could feel awkward and clunky. The story followed a warrior with a moral compass that was a little shaky on a quest tied to ancient powers. The world building was surprisingly rich, with Polynesian-inspired mythology and environments that broke away from the usual medieval fantasy cliches. But here's the thing, it was short. Like really short. You could finish it in under 10 hours, and with no multiplayer or much replay value. A lot of players felt burned for paying full price. Still, it's the kind of game that sticks in your head years later. The unique art direction, inventive combat, and gutsy tonal mix make it stand out from a sea of early 2000s action games. Sure, it's rough around the edges and over too soon, but it's also one of those titles that makes you wish it had been given a bigger budget and a second chance. When Okage Shadow King hit the PS2 in 2001, it was competing in a golden era for JRPGs, Final Fantasy X, Kingdom Hearts, Suikoden 3. And here comes this oddball game about a shy boy named Ari, who accidentally gets possessed by an evil king trapped in a shadow. Not exactly the sweeping, epic premise RPG fans were expecting, and that's part of why it got lost in the shuffle. The game's charm is immediate if you're into weird humor. The dialogue is witty in that dry, almost sarcastic way. The characters are unapologetically strange, and the art style has this Tim Burton meets children's book vibe that still looks unique today. It's a world where absurdity is just part of the atmosphere. One minute you're battling pumpkin-headed monsters, the next you're dealing with bureaucracy over evil deeds. So why didn't it click with most players? For one, the turn-based combat is bare bones, even for the time. The difficulty curve is inconsistent, with random spikes that feel cheap rather than challenging. And while the story is charming, the pacing can be sluggish, especially for players expecting big, dramatic JRPG beats. Critics didn't really know what to make of it, and it reviewed pretty middle of the road. But here's the thing, Okage isn't about flashy battles or complex systems. It's about tone, personality, and a kind of lighthearted surrealism you rarely see in games. Underneath its simple mechanics is a cozy, oddball adventure that rewards players who enjoy games that don't take themselves too seriously. It may not have had the production value of the RPG giants of its time, but it carved out its own space. And for those who played it, it's still one of the most memorable PS2 titles that almost no one talks about. Released in 1998 for the PS1, Echo Night is the kind of game that feels more like flipping through a dusty photo album than playing a blockbuster hit. It's slow, deliberate, and almost entirely about atmosphere. You're not blasting zombies or swinging swords here. You're wandering through haunted spaces, meeting the spirits trapped there, and piecing together the stories of how they ended up stuck in the afterlife. It's part mystery, part ghost tour, and part interactive short story collection. One reason it never got popular is obvious. It moves at a crawl. Even for the time, the pacing was glacial, and the clunky first-person controls didn't help. There's no traditional combat. You defeat ghosts by uncovering the truth behind their deaths, which was a big departure from the action-heavy horror titles players were used to. Critics saw it as niche and, frankly, a little too quiet for mainstream tastes. But that quiet is exactly what makes it interesting. Instead of relying on gore or jump scares, Echo Night builds tension through subtle sound design, unsettling stillness, and the creeping realization that every ghost you meet has a tragic, often human, backstory. It's a game about empathy as much as it is about fear, which was almost unheard of in the late 90s. Sure, it's dated. The visuals are muddy, the controls are stiff, and if you're looking for adrenaline-pumping horror, you'll be bored out of your mind. But if you're the kind of player who loves slow-burn storytelling and doesn't mind a game that takes its time, Echo Night feels like uncovering a lost piece of gaming history. It's haunting in a way a half-remembered dream is haunting, and that's something few games manage to pull off. Mizurna Falls is one of those games that almost feels like an urban legend. Released only in Japan in 1998 for the PS1, It's essentially an open-world murder mystery set in a sleepy Colorado town, clearly inspired by Twin Peaks. You play as high school student Matthew, trying to find a missing classmate, and from the first moment you step into the snow-covered streets, there's this strange, unsettling energy hanging over everything. Why didn't it take off? Well, first off, nobody outside Japan officially got it. Combine that with technical limitations. A game this ambitious on the PS1 was always going to be a little unstable, and you've got something that was destined to fade into obscurity. The frame rate dips hard, the driving controls are awful, and there are plenty of bugs. Even in Japan, critics at the time thought it was more interesting than it was good. But man, the ambition is wild for the era. This was a fully explorable town with a real-time clock, characters with daily schedules, branching dialogue choices, and an investigation that didn't hold your hand. The game just lets you figure things out for better or worse. It feels decades ahead of its time. You can see traces of what later became staples in open-world games. The problem is, if you miss a key event, the story can stall, and the game doesn't care if you're lost. That lack of guidance frustrated a lot of players back then, but now it feels refreshingly bold. Thanks to fan translations, people can finally experience it. And while it's far from perfect, Mizurna Falls is worth playing just to see how far the PS1 could be pushed when a developer decided to ignore every safe design choice. It's a flawed gem, but one that deserves to be studied as much as it's played. When Jade Cocoon released in 1999 for the PS1, it was easy to overlook. Pokemon Mania was in full swing, Final Fantasy VIII was dominating headlines, and smaller RPGs didn't stand much of a chance in the spotlight. On the surface, Jade Cocoon looked like another monster-raising game riding the Pokemon wave, but it had a very different heart beating inside it. You play as Levant, a young cocoon master tasked with capturing and purifying creatures called minions to save his village from a mysterious curse. The hook wasn't just catching monsters, it was fusing them. The fusion system let you merge minions together to create entirely new designs with combined stats and abilities, which was addictive if you liked tinkering and experimenting. And unlike Pokemon, the tone was far more grounded and melancholy, steeped in a mythology inspired by nature and spirituality. So why didn't it become a hit? For starters, it's short. You can finish the story in under 15 hours, and outside of the fusion system, there's not a huge amount of variety in gameplay. The battle system is also slow-paced, with limited animations and repetitive enemy encounters. Reviews at the time called it decent but forgettable, which is pretty much a death sentence for sales in a stacked year like 1999. But I think Jade Cocoon had soul. The art direction, led by Studio Ghibli veteran Katsuya Kondo, gave the world a warm, lived-in feel. The music is understated but atmospheric. The monster designs are imaginative, and the central theme, a coming-of-age story about responsibility and sacrifice, hits harder than you'd expect from such a short game. It's the kind of RPG that quietly gets under your skin, and while it didn't have the legs to become a franchise juggernaut, it's still worth revisiting if you want something more meditative and personal from the monster collecting genre. By the time Heart of Darkness finally released in 1998 for the PS1, it already felt like a relic from a different era. Development had dragged on for years, and what was once going to be a cutting-edge PC title ended up competing against 3D heavyweights like Metal Gear Solid and Resident Evil 2. On the surface, it looked like a whimsical platformer about a boy rescuing his dog from the forces of darkness. In reality, it was one of the most surprisingly grim and punishing games of its generation. The game is essentially a cinematic platformer in the vein of Another World or Flashback. You play as Andy, a kid who gets pulled into a surreal and dangerous shadow world. The backgrounds are lush and hand-drawn. The animation is incredibly fluid, and the cutscenes for 1998 were jaw-dropping. But all that beauty hit a game that was absolutely merciless. One wrong step, and Andy dies instantly, often in gruesome ways from shadow monsters, plants, or just falling wrong. This harsh trial and error design frustrated a lot of players and critics. The checkpoints could be unforgiving, and the precision required for certain jumps made it feel more like memorization than skill at times. Combined with its deceptively cute marketing, plenty of people bounced off it hard. Still, for those who stuck with it, Heart of Darkness was unforgettable. Its atmosphere was strangely unsettling for what looked like a kid's game, and the sense of wonder in exploring its alien landscapes was balanced by the constant threat of instant death. The combination of gorgeous visuals, haunting music, and high stakes gave a unique flavor that hasn't really been replicated since. It's flawed, sure, but it's also the kind of game that sticks in your memory precisely because it didn't play it safe. Released for the PS2 in 2004, Kuon was From Software before From Software was cool. Long before Dark Souls and Elden Ring put the studio on the map, they were experimenting with this quiet, eerie slice of survival horror set in Japan's Heian period, a setting almost no other horror game has touched. You play as 3 different characters across intertwining storylines, all trapped in a cursed mansion crawling with spirits, demons, and worse. Part of the reason Kuon never took off was timing. The survival horror boom was winding down, the PS2 library was stacked with heavy hitters, and it didn't exactly scream must-buy from its cover art. It also wasn't afraid to move at a snail's pace. Combat is clunky and deliberate, puzzles can be obtuse, and backtracking is constant. For players looking for fast-paced scares, it felt downright sleepy. Reviews at the time were lukewarm at best. But what the game nails is atmosphere. This isn't cheap jump scares or endless gore. It's oppressive, supernatural dread, steeped in Japanese folklore. The sound design is unnerving in that something's behind you way, the lighting is pitch perfect, and the slow pacing actually works in its favor if you let yourself sink into the mood. It's a ghost story that unfolds like a ritual, full of strange imagery and unsettling stillness. Today, Kuon is a sought-after cult classic, both because of its rarity and its distinct flavor of horror. It's not perfect, you'll fight the controls as much as the spirits, but there's nothing else quite like it. For those willing to accept its flaws, it offers a haunting, slow-burn experience that feels genuinely different from anything else in the PS2's horror lineup. Hogs of War landed in that weird in-between moment. 2D classics still ruled living rooms. The PS2 was looming, and 3D strategy was clumsy. A turn-based tactics game about militarized pigs, packed with dry British humor, with voice work leaning into it, was never going to top sales charts. Reviews called it scrappy and dated the day it arrived. Fair, its chunky visuals, fidgety camera, and fussy aiming made a messy first impression, especially next to cleaner arcade hits of the time. But under the slapstick is a smart, surprisingly tense tactics game built for couch rivalry. Turns are a little mini-drama. Line up a tricky arc, judge distance, commit, then either nail a perfect hit or whiff into a pond and hand your friend bragging rights for a week. Maps use height and sight lines in ways that reward planning over luck, and the promotion system quietly adds depth. Pigs evolve into specialized roles, changing how you approach each skirmish. It's simple to pick up, but after a few rounds, positioning, resource timing, and target priority matter a lot more than the goofy presentation suggests. The flaws haven't vanished. The camera still fights you on slopes. Precision shots sometimes feel more lottery than skill, and the single-player campaign can spike in uneven ways. Animations chew time between turns, which can test patience if you're solo. And the humor, while distinctive, won't land for everyone. It's very of its era. Why it deserves a second chance? Because few games capture that living room electricity anymore. It's perfect one more match material. Loud, scrappy, endlessly quotable, with just enough tactical bite to keep rematches interesting. If you grew up on party games and artillery puzzlers, this scratches that same itch while feeling different from the usual suspects. Bring friends, embrace the chaos, and let the inevitable bad shot become the night's best running joke. Slot this into your lineup. When Haunting Ground dropped in 2005, it had all the makings of a cult classic and then promptly disappeared under the radar. Part of the problem was that it came out late in the PS2's life, right after Resident Evil 4 rewrote the horror playbook, making traditional survival horror feel dated to a lot of players. Plus, Capcom barely marketed it. If you didn't stumble across it in a bargain bin, you probably never heard of it. The premise is pure nightmare fuel. You play Fiona, a young woman trapped in a sprawling, gothic castle, hunted by a series of deeply unsettling pursuers. Your main defense is Huey, a loyal German shepherd who's more than just a gimmick. He can find items and even sense danger before you do. It's one of the few games where the AI companion is not only tolerable, but essential to the whole experience. Why it didn't review well is pretty clear. The pacing is slow, the camera wants to fight you, and Fiona's movement sometimes feels frustratingly floaty. The game also leans heavily on trial and error chases that can be exhausting if you're not in the right mood. But when it clicks, the tension is unmatched. The castle itself is a character. Its twisting hallways, hidden rooms, and eerie atmosphere make every corner feel dangerous. What makes Haunting Ground special is how vulnerable it makes you feel. There's no overpowered shotgun or magic spell here, just you, a dog, and your wits. The relationship you build with Huey adds a surprising emotional layer, and the game's unsettling tone sticks with you long after you're done. It's a slower burn than most horror titles, but for players willing to sink into its unnerving rhythm, it's an unforgettable, nerve-wracking ride that deserved way more love than it got.